James, you look amazing." The words hung in the air between us, as false as the smile plastered across my wife's face. Elaine stood on my doorstep, not our doorstep, not anymore, clutching her designer purse with white knuckles. Beside her, our daughter Madeline shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting everywhere except directly at me. 4 years, 2 months and 17 days since they'd walked out of the hospital room, where I lay wondering if I'd live another 6 months. 4 years of complete silence, broken only by divorce papers delivered by courier 3 weeks after. My first round of chemotherapy. Now here they stood on a perfect spring morning, as if they had every right to be there, as if time had simply paused while they were away. "We heard about your Uncle Robert," Elaine continued when I didn't immediately respond. "Such wonderful news about the inheritance. We thought perhaps we should talk." I studied them both carefully, noting the details they wouldn't realize. I'd notice the slight tremor in Elaine's hand, the designer clothes that still had tags partially hidden, Madeline's new iPhone that she'd normally be clutching but was conspicuously absent. The timing was impeccable. Uncle Robert's estate had only been settled last week, the $8.2 million inheritance hitting my account 3 days ago. Too precise to be coincidence, too calculated to be genuine reconciliation. I stepped back from the doorway, gesturing them, inside with the arm that still bore surgical scars from the port they'd used for chemotherapy. "By all means," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Let's talk. My name is James Mercer, 47 years old, senior architect at Denison & Partners, where I design structures meant to withstand once-in-a-century storms and earthquakes. I build things to last through catastrophes, a professional specialty that became grimly personal when I was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma 4 years ago. The prognosis was guarded but hopeful. 63% 5-year survival rate with aggressive treatment. Difficult odds but workable. I approached my diagnosis the same way I approached challenging structural problems, methodically, breaking it down into manageable components, researching extensively, consulting experts, and developing a comprehensive plan. Elaine's response was different. When the oncologist finished explaining the treatment protocol, 6 months of chemotherapy followed, by radiation and possibly immunotherapy. She'd nodded thoughtfully, asked appropriate questions, squeezed my hand reassuringly. Later that night, I found her in our bedroom, systematically packing a suitcase. "What are you doing?" I'd asked, though the answer was visibly apparent. "I can't do this, James," she replied without turning to face me. "I'm not strong enough to." "Watch you waste away, and Madeline, she's 17, she shouldn't have to deal with this." "Deal with what?" "My illness isn't a choice, Elaine. I'm not doing this on purpose." She finally turned, her expression a strange mixture of anger and what appeared to be genuine regret. "I know that. But this isn't what I signed up for. Sickness, hospitals, possibly years of caregiving. I need to think about myself too. About Madeline." The conversation that followed was surprisingly devoid of drama. No shouting, no throwing of objects. Just the quiet dismantling of 18 years of marriage in under 40 minutes. Elaine had planned this, I realized during our discussion. The lymphoma diagnosis had simply accelerated a departure she'd already been contemplating. She and Madeline would stay with her sister in Connecticut until they found their own place. Madeline would finish her senior year at a new high school. They would be fine. I would need to focus on getting well. "Will you at least bring Madeline to visit?" I'd asked, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the conversation. "Let's see how treatment goes," Elaine had replied vaguely. "Hospitals upset her. They left the next morning while I was on a call with my health insurance provider." "No." Proper goodbye, just a note propped against the coffee maker. "We'll call when we're settled." They didn't. 3 weeks later, divorce papers arrived. Reasonable terms, all things considered. Elaine waived alimony in exchange for our vacation property in Vermont and half of our savings. Nothing specifically addressing my illness or prognosis. Just clean legal severance, as if excising a tumor. The day I signed those papers was the last time I allowed myself to indulge in anger or self-pity. I had more important battles to focus on. I threw myself into treatment with the same methodical determination I applied to architectural challenges. I documented every medication, every side effect, every blood test result. I modified my diet based on oncological nutrition research, exercised when my body permitted, and built a support network of friends and colleagues who stepped up when family stepped away. The treatment was brutal, worse than I'd anticipated despite extensive research. There were days I couldn't stand without assistance, nights I couldn't keep water down, weeks where my immune system was so compromised that visitors had to wear masks and gloves. Through it all, I kept working when possible, designing from a hospital bed or home office, sending sketches and calculations to my team. The work kept me anchored to the future, a future I was determined to see. Neither Elaine nor Madeline called during those months. I sent Madeline texts, brief, undemanding messages of love and support. Most went unanswered. The few responses were terse, clearly obligatory. After 6 months, I stopped trying. The cancer was demanding enough of my energy. I couldn't afford to spend what little remained on one-sided relationships. Recovery came in increments. Successful completion of chemotherapy. Clear scan after radiation. Experimental immunotherapy that left me exhausted but showed promising results. At the 1-year mark, my oncologist used the word remission for the first time, though cautiously. By the 2-year mark, the caution had diminished. Now, 4 years post-diagnosis, I was considered a success story, not fully out of the woods, but with an increasingly confident prognosis. During those 4 years, I rebuilt my life, piece by piece. I sold the too-large family home and bought a modern, efficient condo in the city, closer to my office. I advanced to senior partner at the firm, my portfolio expanding to include hospitals and research facilities, a focus inspired by my own experiences. I traveled when my health allowed, hiked mountains I'd never had time for before, reconnected with old friends and made new ones. I also inherited $8.2 million from my Uncle Robert, my mother's brother, and a lifelong bachelor who'd built a surprisingly successful engineering supply business. We'd always been close. He'd inspired my interest in architecture and structural design, but the size of the inheritance was unexpected. Robert had no children of his own and had divided his estate among a handful of nieces and nephews, with me receiving the largest portion. The inheritance made headlines in local business publications, which explained how Elaine and Madeline had suddenly remembered my existence after 4 years of silence. As they settled onto my living room sofa, I noticed how they took in the surroundings, the expensive minimalist furniture, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their commanding view of the city. I'd done well for myself, and the condo reflected that success. I'd designed some of the custom features myself during recovery, when focusing on creating beautiful spaces helped distract from physical discomfort. "Coffee," I offered, moving toward the kitchen. "That would be lovely," Elaine responded with the practiced warmth she'd always used with business associates she didn't particularly like but needed to impress. I prepared 3 cups, giving myself time to observe them when they thought I wasn't looking. Madeline, now 21, had changed significantly. The teenager who'd left was now a young woman, though with shadows under her eyes that suggested recent stress. Elaine looked older than her 45 years, fine lines around her mouth that makeup couldn't quite conceal. They whispered to each other, stopping abruptly when I returned with the coffee. "So," I said, settling into an armchair across from them. "It's been a while." "James," Elaine began, leaning forward slightly, "I know we have a lot to discuss, a lot of water under the bridge, but first, let me just say how wonderful it is to see you looking so healthy. When we left, the prognosis seemed so uncertain. 63% 5-year survival rate," I replied matter-of-factly. "Better odds than most investments you've made." She flinched slightly at the precision, the lack of emotional cushioning. "Yes, well, we're so glad. You beat those odds. Madeline and I have talked a lot about everything, about how we handled things." Madeline nodded on cue but remained silent, studying her coffee cup as if it contained ancient mysteries. "And what conclusions did you reach?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, observational. "That we made a mistake," Elaine said, setting her cup down with deliberate care. "We were afraid, and we reacted badly. I reacted badly. I convinced myself I was protecting Madeline, But really I was protecting myself from potential pain, and that was wrong. It was a well-crafted statement, just self-critical enough to seem genuine, just vulnerable enough to elicit sympathy. 4 years ago I might have accepted it at face value. Cancer had changed many things, including my tolerance for comforting fictions. "And you've both spent 4 years reflecting on this mistake?" I asked. "Without once reaching out, even after hearing I was in remission?" Elaine's cheeks flushed slightly. "We should have, there's no excuse. But sometimes the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. We weren't sure you'd want to hear from us after everything. Until you heard about Uncle Robert's inheritance," I said, completing the thought she was carefully avoiding. The tension in the room shifted perceptibly. Madeline's eyes darted to her mother, then back to her coffee. Elaine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's unfair, James," she said softly. "Yes, we heard about the inheritance. News travels. But that was just the push we needed to. Finally do what we should have done years ago. Reach out, apologize, try to rebuild some kind of relationship. It was a reasonable recovery, delivered with the right blend of hurt and resilience." Elaine had always been skilled at these conversational pivots. Before cancer, I might have backed down, accepted the deflection to preserve harmony. Now I simply waited, saying nothing, a technique I'd learned from my oncologist when discussing difficult prognoses. The silence stretched until Madeline finally broke it. "Mom, stop." Her voice was quiet but firm. "This isn't right, and you know it." Elaine shot her a warning glance, but Madeline continued, turning to face me directly for the first time. "Dad, I'm sorry. We're not here because we suddenly had a change of heart. Mom's in trouble, financial trouble, big trouble." "Madeline," Elaine hissed, but her daughter ignored her. "She made some bad investments, got involved with a guy who turned out to be running some kind of Ponzi scheme. We lost the Vermont house, and she's facing possible criminal charges because she recruited some of her friends into this thing without realizing it was fraudulent. We need help, and when we heard about your inheritance, the truth, when it finally emerged, was both predictable and disappointing. After the divorce, Elaine had invested much of her settlement in what seemed like an exclusive investment opportunity, introduced by a man she'd been dating. The returns initially seemed impressive, encouraging her to invest more and bring in friends and family members. 6 months ago, the scheme had collapsed, leaving her not only financially devastated, but potentially legally exposed. She'd burned through her remaining assets trying to pay back friends before they pursued legal action. Madeline's situation was equally concerning. She'd dropped out of college after her sophomore year, struggling with anxiety and depression that had gone largely untreated. She'd been working retail jobs while living with Elaine, but recent months had seen them moving between increasingly cheaper apartments as funds dwindled. "We're about to be evicted," Madeline concluded, her voice steady despite the embarrassment, evident in her posture. "Mom thought, we thought you might be willing to help given the inheritance, a loan maybe, or a clean slate," Elaine interjected, recovering her composure. "Her chance for all of us to start fresh. We've all made mistakes, James, all of us. Maybe this is an opportunity to heal old wounds." I absorbed this information without visible reaction, decades of professional experience making it second nature, to maintain composure while processing complex scenarios. Inside, however, I was cataloging details, analyzing patterns, and evaluating options with the same methodical approach I'd applied to my cancer treatment. "I appreciate your honesty, Madeline," I said finally. "It can't have been easy to share that, especially given our estrangement." I turned to Elaine. "I'll need time to consider this situation carefully. I assume you have documentation regarding the investment fraud, the potential legal issues." She nodded, seemingly relieved by my businesslike approach. "I can get everything. To you, there's quite a bit. Statements, correspondence with the authorities, legal opinions." "Good, send it all. I'll review it and we can discuss options." I stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "In the meantime, how urgent is the eviction situation?" "We have until the end of the month," Elaine said. "About 2 weeks," I nodded. "I'll be in touch before then." After they left, I sat alone in my living room for a long time, processing the encounter. The rational architect in me wanted to approach this as a straightforward structural problem, assess the damage, determine if repair was possible or if demolition was necessary, design a solution based on objective criteria. But this wasn't a building. It was my family, or what remained of it, now returning only when they needed something they believed I could provide. The next morning I called Stephen Park, my attorney since before the cancer diagnosis. After explaining the situation, I asked him to verify Elaine's claims about the investment fraud and potential legal exposure. "I can do that," he said. "But James, I have to ask, are you actually considering helping them, after everything?" "I'm considering all options," I replied carefully. "I need complete information before making any decisions." 3 days later, Stephen confirmed the broad strokes of Elaine's story. She had indeed lost significant money in an investment scheme that had collapsed. There were ongoing investigations, though her legal exposure appeared somewhat less dramatic than she'd suggested, more negligent than criminal, though still potentially costly. I then contacted a private investigator I'd worked with on building security assessments. "I need a complete financial and personal profile," I explained, providing Elaine's and Madeline's information. Current situation, debts, assets, recent activities, comprehensive but discreet. The report, delivered 5 days later, filled in the remaining gaps. Elaine's financial situation was indeed dire. Nearly $280,000 in debt, credit destroyed, retirement accounts emptied. Her current apartment was their third in 18 months, each one less expensive than the last. She'd been through 3 jobs in 4 years. The most recent ended under unclear circumstances. Madeline's situation was more complex. She had indeed struggled with mental health issues, with several therapy attempts that hadn't been sustained due to insurance or financial limitations. Her work history was sporadic, but there were promising elements. A photography portfolio online that showed genuine talent, volunteer work at an animal shelter, positive references from her most recent employer despite her having to leave due to her mother's situation. With this information compiled, I spent a weekend alone in my condo, weighing options and crafting a response. Cancer had taught me the importance of boundaries, of preserving energy for what truly mattered, of not wasting limited time on situations that drained rather than sustained. It had also taught me about forgiveness, not the sentimental kind. That pretends harm never occurred, but the pragmatic kind that acknowledges reality while choosing a path forward. By Sunday evening, I had developed a plan, not driven by emotion or retribution, but by careful assessment of what was actually possible given the realities we all faced. I invited Elaine and Madeline to meet me at my attorney's office rather than my home, a choice that visibly unsettled Elaine when they arrived. Stephen was present, along with a financial advisor I trusted. Once everyone was seated in the conference room, I began without preamble. "I've reviewed your situation thoroughly," I said, opening a folder containing the reports I'd commissioned. "I've verified the investment fraud, the current debts, the eviction timeline, and various other elements." Elaine's expression shifted from hope to wariness. "You had us investigated?" "Yes," I replied simply. "Just as you researched my inheritance before reaching out. We all need accurate information to make sound decisions." Before she could respond, I continued, "I've developed a proposal that addresses the immediate crisis while establishing clear parameters for any ongoing relationship." I distributed copies of a document Stephen had helped prepare. "Please review this carefully." The proposal was comprehensive but straightforward. I would establish a managed trust of $400,000, enough to resolve Elaine's most pressing legal issues, secure stable housing, and provide a runway for rebuilding. However, I would not give her direct access to these funds. A financial trustee would pay creditors directly, cover approved living expenses, and provide structured allowances. Additionally, Elaine would need to complete financial management counseling and maintain regular employment. For Madeline, I proposed a separate arrangement. I would cover the costs for her to complete her college education, including mental health support, regardless of her mother's compliance with the trust conditions. Additionally, I would provide startup funding for her photography if she developed a viable business plan. "This isn't what we expected," Elaine said after reviewing the document, her voice tight. No, I agreed. You expected either outright rejection or a blank check. This is neither. It's a structured solution that addresses real needs while acknowledging past patterns. It feels like I'd be treated like a child, she protested. Supervised spending, mandatory counseling. It feels like accountability, I corrected gently. The same accountability I faced with cancer. I couldn't wish it away or ignore treatment. Protocols because they were uncomfortable. I had to follow a structured plan for recovery. I turned to Madeline, who had been silent throughout. Your arrangements are separate. Your mother's decisions won't affect your educational support. That's non-negotiable. Madeline looked up from the document, something like hope flickering across her face. You'd really pay for me to finish school, even after everything? Yes. Your actions when you were 17, largely influenced by your mother, don't define your future potential. But this isn't a gift without expectations. I expect consistent effort, regular progress updates, and genuine engagement with mental health support. Elaine interrupted, her voice sharp. This is manipulative, James, using money to control us, to force certain behaviors. I considered this accusation carefully before responding. Is that how you see it? Because from my perspective, I'm offering substantial financial assistance with conditions designed to create sustainable change, rather than temporary relief. You're free to decline. And what happens then? We're out on the street in 2 weeks. I met her gaze directly. I've arranged for a 3-month payment of rent on your current apartment, regardless of your decision about this proposal. That gives you time to find alternatives if my terms are unacceptable. I'm not interested in punishment, Elaine, only in not perpetuating patterns that ultimately harm everyone involved. The meeting continued for another hour, clarifying details, answering questions, adjusting certain parameters to address legitimate concerns. Throughout, I maintained the calm, analytical approach that had guided me through cancer treatment, focused on solutions rather than recriminations, on future possibilities rather than past injuries. 2 days later, Elaine reluctantly accepted the terms. Madeline engaged more positively, scheduling a meeting with an academic advisor to discuss returning to college in the fall semester. In the months that followed, the structured approach yielded mixed but generally positive results. Elaine chafed under the financial oversight, but gradually stabilized her situation. With legal issues resolved and stable housing secured, she found steady employment and began slowly rebuilding her credit. Our relationship remained formal, defined primarily by quarterly meetings to review trust performance, rather than any meaningful personal reconnection. Madeline's path proved more encouraging. She returned to college, majoring in visual arts with a business minor. The therapy I funded helped her work through both the trauma of my cancer diagnosis and the guilt she carried about leaving. We began rebuilding a relationship, tentative at first, then increasingly genuine. She spent weekends at my condo occasionally, sharing her photography projects and gradually filling in the 4-year gap in our knowledge of each other's lives. Year after their return, I received my 5-year cancer-free confirmation, a significant milestone in remission. I invited both Elaine and Madeline to dinner to share the news. Elaine declined politely, citing work commitments. Madeline came, bringing a framed photograph she'd taken of the cancer center where I'd received treatment, the building captured. Fair dawn with light breaking through clouds, struggle and hope perfectly balanced in a single image. I never asked how you did it, she said over dessert, how you got through cancer without us, without family. I considered the question carefully. I learned that family isn't just about blood or legal ties. It's about who stands with you when standing is the hardest thing to do. I built a different kind of family during treatment. Friends, colleagues, medical staff, support groups. People who chose to be present. She nodded, tears forming. I should have been there. You were 17 following your mother's lead, I said gently. The question isn't what you did then, but what you choose now, with adult eyes and understanding. My wife and daughter left me during cancer. Later, they returned for an $8 million inheritance, but what they found instead was a man transformed by adversity, neither bitter nor naive, neither punitive nor passive. a man who had rebuilt himself methodically the way he designed buildings to withstand disasters, with careful assessment, strategic reinforcement, and an eye toward future storms. The inheritance gave me leverage, but cancer had already given me perspective. In the end, that perspective proved more valuable than any amount of money, the clear-eyed recognition that while we cannot control how others treat us during our darkest moments, we can always control how we respond when the darkness passes and those same people return seeking light.